Ooh, ah. It's almost 4th of July. Fireworks, backyard cookouts, red, white, and blue, flags, parades, family gatherings. For a lot of people, this is one of the happiest weekends of the year. But every year around this time, I find myself thinking a lot about a different group of people. I think about my military clients, my veterans, my first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, EMS, because I know that while many people hear celebration, others hear something completely different. A loud boom isn't just a loud boom. Sometimes it's a memory. Sometimes it's a conditioned response. Sometimes the nervous system reacts before the thinking part of the brain has even had a chance to catch up. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not just PTSD, not just fireworks, but how our brains learn. Because I think understanding that changes the entire conversation about stress, alcohol, and recovery. Think about this for a minute. The fireworks themselves aren't dangerous. They're just compressed chemicals creating light and sound. That's all. Yet the exact same stimulus can produce excitement in one person and sheer terror in another. Why? Because our brains don't respond only to what's happening right now. They respond to something what something has come to mean. Our brains are constantly asking 3 questions. Have I experienced this before? What happened last time? What should I do now? That's not weakness. That's survival. That's learning. It's actually one of the most remarkable and powerful things our brains do. When we talk about PTSD, we're talking about a nervous system that learned something important. A sound, a smell, a place, a season, a particular date on the calendar. Our brain formed an association designed to keep that person alive and safe. The problem isn't that the brain learned. The problem is that sometimes the learning continues long after the danger has passed. Now, here's where I want to broaden the conversation, because I think we make a mistake if we believe conditioning only happens in trauma. It doesn't. Our brains are learning every single day, whether we intend them to or not. Think about your own life. You grab your morning coffee, and before you know it, you're opening your email. You get in your car, and halfway home, you're replaying every meeting you had that day. Friday afternoon arrives, and suddenly your brain says, we made it. I've earned this. Maybe that means pizza. Maybe that means takeout. Maybe it means sitting on the patio. Maybe it means pouring a drink. Those aren't moral failures. They're learned associations. Your brain noticed that something produced relief. Then it remembered that. One of the things I teach is that executive stress doesn't simply change how we feel. It changes what our brains learn. Professionals spend years making decisions, managing crisis, leading people, solving problems, being available, being responsible, being on. Eventually, the brain starts looking for efficient ways to transition out of that state. Not because it's lazy, because efficiency is one of the brain's greatest strengths. It remembers what worked yesterday, then it offers the same solution today. Again, not because it's trying to sabotage you, because that's literally its job. That's one of the reasons I don't spend a lot of time talking about willpower. Willpower isn't a very satisfying explanation for something the brain has spent years practicing. If every evening your nervous system experienced relief after a glass of wine or bourbon or beer, your brain learned something. It learned this helps. Whether it actually helped long-term is another discussion. But in the moment, it reduced discomfort. Brains remember that. That's why I check in with military members and first responders every year around this time. Not because I assume fireworks will automatically become a problem, and not because every veteran struggles with fireworks. Many don't. But I know this season increases stress for some people. It brings reminders, anniversaries, memories, conversations, grief, images, news coverage, fear. And whenever stress increases, old pathways become easier to activate. And that's true whether we're talking about PTSD, alcohol, anxiety, depression, or any learned coping strategy. Stress changes the environment in which every trigger lands. Which brings me to July. But before we move into July, I want to connect a few dots. Throughout June, we've been talking about Professional Wellness Month and PTSD Awareness Month. On the surface, those sound like two completely different conversations. But I don't think they are. Whether we're talking about executives living under chronic pressure, veterans, first responders, healthcare professionals, or anyone trying to function under prolonged stress, the underlying question is remarkably similar. How does stress shape what the brain learns? How do those learned patterns eventually influence the way we think, feel, and cope? Fireworks are one example. Alcohol is another. Chronic overwork is another. So can perfectionism, isolation, overachievement, emotional withdrawal, or any other unhealthy coping behavior that temporarily reduces discomfort? Different people, different circumstances, the same remarkably adaptable brain. That's why I think July is the perfect month to shift our attention from trauma itself to something every one of us experiences. Triggers. Believe it or not, July is National Anti-Boredom Month. I know, it sounds like one of those holidays somebody invented because the calendar had an empty square. But I actually love the idea, because boredom is one of the most common triggers that clients report. I drink because I'm bored. I crave alcohol when I'm bored. I don't know what to do with myself. After more than 35 years in recovery and doing this work, I'm not convinced boredom is usually boredom. I think it's often something else that's wearing boredom's name tag. Sometimes it's fatigue. Sometimes it's burnout. Sometimes it's loneliness. Sometimes it's understimulation after years of constant stimulation. Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's a nervous system that has forgotten how to experience pleasure without alcohol. And sometimes it's simply a brain looking for something familiar. So throughout July, I want to spend some time talking about triggers, not just people, places, and things. I think that phrase is useful and we'll be talking about it, but I also think it's incomplete. We'll certainly talk about people. We'll talk about places, and we'll talk about things, but we'll also talk about stress, fatigue, celebration, success, loneliness, pain, grief, boredom. Because what we experience psychologically almost always has something happening biologically underneath it. And if you've been with me for a while, you already know one of my favorite ideas. What is psychological is biological. Your brain is always learning, which means every trigger tells us something. Not that you're broken, not that you failed, not that you're doomed to repeat the past. A trigger gives us information that your brain has learned something important. The question isn't, why am I having this trigger? The more useful question is, what did my brain learn? Because once we understand what it learned, we can begin teaching it something healthier. And that's exactly where we're headed next month. I'll see you then.